Yeah, first of all, thank you also from my end for inviting us, Katrin, for reaching out and thinking that our research that is indeed ongoing and that we're therefore very happy to receive comments from your end is interesting for you and at CEF. So yes, I'm first of all sorry that I'm not there in person, and this is due to actually not the strike, but the construction that is ongoing once again between Cologne and Bonn. But very happy that Armin has made it to be there in person. So this is the research we are presenting today is joint research with two Ethiopian partners that we have established long-term collaboration with over the past years. It's Abdirahman Mohammed Ahmed at the Jigjiga University in Ethiopia and Abis Getachew at eSurf Consults. And both of us from IDOS, and we bring in kind of the, yes, we're both senior researchers and team leads, but Armin is more from the social cohesion side, as he has been co-leading the project on social cohesion at IDOS for several years. And I come in from kind of the migration refugee side from that project at IDOS. So this is today our first evidence from the accompanying impact measurement that we did jointly with the GIZ. So I'll speak a bit more about that in the following slides. And as they have implemented their for the past years already inclusive TVET classes, and we asked the question how promising this really is for fostering social cohesion and employment in this displacement context. So Armin, if you go one further. Thank you very much. So as a motivation and starting point for us from a policy perspective, those TVET, or I don't know how many of you know those kind of programs, but they are training programs that are conducted at colleges often, and they have been for many, many years very prominent tools of international national development actors, with the primary aim always to increase the employability and then also the income of its successful participants. In times of increased displacement and also long-term displacement, this has also gained a lot of popularity to be used in displacement settings. So to use it as a tool to integrate refugees into the formal labor market. On the side, many of those practitioners implementing this claim that next to the kind of employment effects, TVET has also significant effects on the social dimension, and here also on social cohesion more generally. However, now going to the academic perspective, there is a lot of literature, but up to now it's quite inconclusive. So there is particularly gaps in knowledge in global south settings, and then even more so with respect to refugees on their real improved employability and access to the labor market and income effects. And there is hardly any evidence more generally on social impact of TVET programs. And I think we have seen no study with respect to refugee host settings. There's quite some literature actually on kind of contact theory and how improved contact decreases discrimination and improves tolerance, but mostly then with respect to ethnic lines or existing conflict lines, not in kind of refugee host communities. So to give you like a quick glance at the context we're working in, I don't know, as I don't know who is in the room or online at all, how many of you know Ethiopia? So Ethiopia is the country where we conducted this study, and it's the third largest refugee host country in Africa with almost 1 million refugees there. And in most parts of the country, it's still encampment strategy that is in place, whereas there are some refugees, and that's mostly Eritrean, because here the out-of-camp policy applies in the capital Addis Ababa. But most refugees, as you also see in this map, are hosted in the frontier regions next to the neighboring country where most refugees come from, and they're in camps, so they're not allowed to move. Many of them are in long-term, so protracted displacement situations. And what is important to know in our context is that Ethiopia was very fast and actually in certain dimensions successful in implementing the Comprehensive Refugee Response Framework, or so-called CRRF, where the country promised to improve on dimensions of local integration. This included access to tertiary education, formal work permits, and things like that to kind of improve the lives of the refugees in the country. And here on that map, you already see the two implementation sites that we are going to look at. So if we move to the next slide, I'll give you some context to the training program that we look at. So as said before, we partnered with the GIZ Ethiopia, who implements their this TVET training jointly with public vocational schools. So they worked first to improve the curricula of those trainings in different occupational fields, and then financed this short-term 6 months training. And the innovative part of it is that it's a joint training approach where members of the refugee and host community are jointly trained. It also includes some days on social cohesion training, on conflict training, things like that. And in order to ease the entry into the formal labor market, the GIZ also partnered with firms and offers to a selected group of those participants kind of an internship style firm placement that is subsidized. As said before, we have two study sites. One is Addis Ababa, the capital, where we have a very urban context with mostly, so a very, very large majority of only Eritrean refugees. It's important to know here that they are relatively similar to the host community. Most often they speak Amharic, so the language that is used, so the language of Ethiopia, with no restrictions on movement. And then contrary to that, Asosa, which is on the western part of Ethiopia, bordering South Sudan and Sudan. So that is where most of the refugees are coming from. It's a rather rural context, and there's active encampment. So refugees are not allowed to leave camps, and it was an exception for them to participate in this training in those colleges that are located just outside of those camps, to travel outside of those camps to participate. So you see there's like a different dimension to that. And in general, if we move to the next slide, we ask our question here, what the long and short-term impact of this inclusive training has on employment, income. We won't present that here, and social cohesion between refugee and host participants. So for us, currently this has those three dimensions. One is the effect on kind of more the economic side of it, employment and income, the social effect with respect to social cohesion. But then we also, and we won't elaborate much on this here, we look at kind of the differences in context later on, as we have data from Asosa and others, and both contexts are very different for those colleges. Overall, in this presentation, we'll focus more on social cohesion, as we have dived yeah, it's fine. You can already move onwards. Thanks, Armin. As we dive deeper into the data here, and I would like to present some findings there. So to give you some insights into the study design and data that we collected, as said before, this is impact-oriented accompanying research. So a lot of energy also went into partnering with GIZ, into defining and finding out what joint interests are and how we can set this up. This also meant that we had continuous contact with them and interaction in order to feedback certain first results to them. It's a parallel mixed method design, meaning that we collected qualitative and quantitative data more or less at the same time in 3 waves during 21, 22, and 23. And in total, we then have now 160 semi-structured interviews with TVET participants at different times of the training. So some that already had finished the training, some that were in during the training, and some afterwards. From different occupational fields they're trained in, and this was done in Addis Abeba and in Asosa. We added to that in parallel survey interviews, in total a bit more than 1,000 with TVET participants. That was again at different times of the training from different occupational fields, only in Addis Abeba. So the quantitative data that we're presenting is only from Addis, and almost 1,000 interviews with the comparable control group from the refugee and host community. To just give you a quick introduction of whom are we looking at. So overall, people are roughly 28 years old. We have equal distribution of gender. Most of them are not married. And then we have more or less an equal distribution of refugee and host community. And most of them are Orthodox. This is the quantitative data again. We make use of this panel setup that we have as we follow control group and participants across those 3 data collection points in time. And now looking at the employment side of the quantitative results here. So overall, what we do see is there is no general effect of TVET participation. You don't see that here, but I tell you of the TVET participation on employment. We do find interesting heterogeneous effects on both communities. So we find an improved employment opportunities for refugees, however, a negative effect of probability of being employed for the host community. This is a random effects estimations. You see the notes down there. And this was chosen also in order to look at the individual characteristics that you see here. So at the control variables that are usually used in employment regressions as such. We do find, and that is also very much in line with the literature, a positive effect for men. So they profit generally more from those kind of trainings. And if we move to the next slide, because there we have the qualitative results, and this is actually also speaking to what we find in the quantitative, is that overall, while both communities have the feeling that the training improved their skill level, which is good, however, they do not see that it increased their opportunities to get a job. So one quote reads, "The TVET program improved my knowledge or skills, but there's no employment opportunity." And similarly, this is reflected for the refugee interview. So, you know, the major factor is the formal employment opportunities are not present for refugees at large scale yet in Ethiopia. So we see that in the quote down there. "Still, I cannot get a work permit. I am doing under the permission of my uncle." I mean, the work permit is not mine, and it belongs to my uncle. So this is something we've seen all over the interviews. Now, if you go back one more time. So what I wanted to point out here, and this is also what we've seen in the quantitative results, is that we do see sector-specific differences. So for certain training fields, there are more positive effects. However, they are linked to often informal employment opportunities. So informal employment probabilities increased. And as refugees also self-selected more prominently in those kind of sectors, it might be that we see the effect we see. Yeah, if you move on now. Just to point out again, the most critical points here is we do see differences across the occupational training fields. In general, increased informal employment, not formal employment. And we have found also particularly strong in the qualitative evidence that the structural limitations of the formal labor market, meaning that there are just not a lot of job opportunities, neither for refugee nor for host community, limits the effects of this TVET program tremendously. What we currently do is we conduct interviews, qualitative interviews at these firms that work together with the GIZ, where at subsidized level trainees are placed to see how they judge this, how this perhaps eases the labor market entry, and how skill match is met there. And I'll stop here and hand over now to my colleague, Armin von Schiller, who is in the room with you, I guess.
Thank you so much, Jana. Also, thank you from my side for being here. I move on in the interest of time. Jana already said we have kind of three big topics. We have employment income, we have social cohesion, and we have this comparison between different settings. Jana gave you some insights on the income side. I will focus now on the social cohesion part. For this, we rely, or at IDOS, we have been working on social cohesion for quite some time. And we developed a concept because you will find thousands of definitions and operationalizations of this. We defined a concept that we feel travels across contexts, and we used it in this work. And this, just to give you an idea, because to contextualize the results that will come, the main idea is that we have three attributes: trust, identity, and cooperation for the common good that have a vertical and an horizontal dimension. So we do not put social cohesion as one concept with one number. We treat it as a multidimensional concept, and we can, and this is the next slide, we can then track the effect on social cohesion, but more specifically on what element of social cohesion the training might have an effect on. To do this, as main specification, we use the following variables that you see there for capturing horizontal, vertical cooperation. So for horizontal cooperation, we ask a lot about whether people help other individuals that they don't know personally. For the vertical cooperation, that meaning the relationship with the state, we ask whether they have signed official petitions in the last 12 months. If we move to trust, which is the literature that is more developed, we rely on a very classical question in the literature to look for horizontal trust, and that's how much do you trust people that you know at a distance. And for the vertical trust, we rely on questions related to state institutions and the relationship you have with them. The work on identity, again, horizontal element. If you have a feel of a sense of belonging to your local community, and to look into the vertical dimension, whether you have a sense of belonging to Ethiopia at large. We think this has conceptual benefits using this kind of concept, but also analytically is very helpful when we try to think about the effects that different interventions can have on social cohesion, because as I said before, we can pinpoint what it is about social cohesion that they are supposed to affect. And many cases we have said, we want to support social cohesion, but what is it exactly that you're expecting to affect? Well, over the next 3 slides, you will see 3 graphs, very similar to the one that Jana presented. We move, I don't know how much, and in the Q&A we can discuss more about that, about identification strategy. Just to give you the background of the 3 graphs that will come. For this, we decided to move to a fixed effects estimation using the panel data. And what you will see now is this kind of graph, where you will see the different elements of social cohesion and the effects in that fixed effects estimation using standard errors clustered at the individual level, you will see the effect of the treatment for different groups defined down here. So you will see the effect on the host community and the refugee here. We exploit this as main results because this is the most interesting part, we think, when we compare these two groups. And what you can see here is that in line with previous research, horizontal trust is very clearly the part that is more positively affected. There is a pretty strong and highly significant effect for both groups. Things look less optimistic on other elements of social cohesion. If we move to vertical trust, host communities still benefit, so it has a positive effect on them. But we see some striking and potentially worrisome negative effects on some of the variables. So for instance, for cooperation, we see that, at least as we measure it in the previous slide, or presented in the previous slide, we have negative effects, and that vertical identity is also negative when we talk about the refugee community. Based on this logic, interacting one variable with the treatment in the fixed effects setup, we can also look at effects over time. The main logic of the effects is very similar. So if we look at average effects over time, or effects over time defining short-term or differentiating short-term and mid-term, the main results are very similar. It's interesting that the effect gets stronger, although the large number of cases, they do not significantly differ from each other, but it seems like the effect accentuates over time. But the basic setup is very similar. On trust, horizontal trust, we have positive effects. If we look into vertical identity and horizontal cooperation, this seems to not be the case. Just because, or not just because of that, we also, and that's the last, I know this is maybe lots of graphs, but just to give you some insight on dividing the effect by gender, I think that's a very important element or research gap that is interesting to look into. We there see that the effects for females seem to be larger in both, in the positive and in the negative direction. So it seems that there is something going on there. Some qualitative evidence backing this. I think it's important to say that when we work with this overall concept, it's a very general societal concept, right? It's probably very ambitious to say that a training should change very much this. We also look through the qualitative element and partly through the quantitative, we're not presented it here, more directly into the micro level interaction between the two groups, right? Not so, let's say, overall social cohesion, but more the relationship dimension between the two groups. And that's something that we capture partly quantitatively, but we also do a lot of work here from a qualitative side. And I think that if we look at the evidence that we have, when we look at people that were trained, when we ask them how the relationship was and whether it developed over time or remained over time, we find quite some evidence that for the group, the specific group going together through this training, it has a positive effect as friendships outlast the training, and after it, the people are in contact. It also shows that it helped, or people report that it helped them to look differently to the other group. At least it's always the difference between the people I know from that group and the other group at large. But to the people they know from the let's say the other group, they report to have some change in attitudes there, and particularly when we talk about trust, that's very, very strong. Here, a little bit not completely in line with what our quantitative data say. We feel, or people report quite a lot, that they sense that the training was positive for the sense of belonging to the community. That's not what showed up when we work with quantitative data. Similarly, if we highlight or summarize very strongly the results, I would say that on the vertical dimension, we see very little going on. And if anything, the effect seems to be negative. So it seems that if this has an effect at all, it has more to do in the relationship between individuals and groups. It does not necessarily change the relationship with state institutions, which again, we could say it's difficult to imagine that that happens, but in the setting of this kind of interventions, people claim that this is supposed to happen. And what we see very strongly is that the intuition that having a job and is related to social cohesion is very strong and very vividly lived by the people participating. So I will not go through all the quotes, but I think it's very clear to them that entering the job market, having actually a job, having their job permit, that's something that is extremely meaningful for them, for the refugee people, obviously in particular, but also if we look at some evidence from the host community, simply this idea that I belong only when I have a job is very strongly communicated as such. Last slide on results. We are presenting to you very different evidence along these three different aspects that we like to analyze: employment, income, social cohesion, and the encampment versus none. We will not go into detail, but I think it's important to say that from the qualitative evidence, because we have no quantitative data from Asosa, so we only have quantitative data from Addis Ababa, it's very clear that how the training works and what it represents for the participants seems to be very different in the different setups. So if we move to Asosa, people, and in particular, of course, the refugees, because they're the ones affected, were saying, if we live in these encampment situations, there's no possibility for us to have any relationships with host community. We feel isolated. We feel out of the world, if I can take the quote there. So for them, it was extremely important. And as Jana said, this participation in school was an exception, specific exceptions for them to go out of the camp and participate with other people. I think that although the implementation of the program seems to have worked well, there was not much thought put into the language issue in advance. So people manage there on the go, but the language issue is a prominent issue in the trainings themselves, in which languages you do the trainings, of course. When you think about it, it's very obvious, but also for the idea of people coming together. Of course, if they don't share the same language, it's very hard for them to communicate and to find that common ground to build up relationships. So that was very prominent in Asosa because of the diverse backgrounds of the people or more diverse background of the people joining the trainings over there. And this idea, connected to this idea that also Jana said at the beginning, there is an element, it seems to work a lot better when there is a preconditions that the group are very similar. This is probably not surprising, but it's important to put this on the table, and particularly if we think in terms of implications and expectations related to this kind of interventions. So coming to an end, to leave room for the Q&A. Open questions or discussions that we openly share with you here. We have different batches over time that we are following, and some batches work better than others. So I presented to you average effects. We know that some batches seem to have performed better than others. We are looking more into that and trying to make sense of that. And timing might be also an issue connected to events like the war in Ethiopia, but also markets entrance closer to COVID and this kind of thing. So we are looking more deeper into that. Again, the critical role of language. Although Jana raised that Ethiopia has been seen as a good performer in terms of the CRRF, we have a huge problem of work permits. So until now, they are not officially, or there's a, Jana could give you, I always mix things up with here, but there is a huge problem and there's a very minimal amount of refugees that have got an official work permit. Of course, this has implications that in terms of how this has been implemented had been ignored. And that partly explains the effect on informal employment before, but it also has an effect, we think, on this social cohesion dimension. And maybe the last point, what we want to say behind that, what stands behind that bullet point is the idea that there is some difference when we talk about social cohesion at large, the quantitative effects that we show there that are modest or even negative, and more this relational effect for the people joining the groups where we see very positive effects. So I think that's also important when we come to our last slide, which is in terms of implications of what we have learned here. As Jana said, this was a project that was implemented closely with the GSZ, which was open in exchanging about the limitations of what they are doing and allowing us to look very deeply into the details of the implementation of this. But as Jana said, TVET is in the recent years been partly legitimized by saying that it has an effect on social cohesion. We have very little evidence that that's the case. But beyond that, even if that's true, which we cannot say, and we don't find strong evidence for that, beyond horizontal trust, our main message here is it seems in many cases it does not work for its primary goal. So we think that it's problematic to legitimize programs through secondary goals if their primary goal is not being achieved. There has been a very technical approach to this without looking into structural limitation of work permits and this kind of things. As we were saying, it's difficult to assume that you will have an effect on formal employment if the people you're training are not allowed to join the formal employment. But these are all things that in planning, this kind of measures have to be taken into account. And the last point, many of us are involved in training, and it's always important to do expectation management when you train people. I think that was also a larger problem with these trainings, that expectation management seems to have been poor in the past, given the expectation that everyone that joins finds a job, something that they had to roll back. And this is very important because these programs can potentially have a positive effect, but also a negative effect, as we see. And implemented wrongly, we think they can have very negative effects. And we want just to raise attention on that dimension that seems to not be very present also in the policy discussion. And with this, I would close. Sorry, we talked a little bit longer than supposed. Sorry for that. And thank you for the interest. I'm very much looking forward to any questions and comments. Thank you.